welcome to this session with Aaron. We will get started, and yeah, hopefully more people will join us. Yeah, but first of all, thanks so much, Aaron, for presenting at this session. And so I will just introduce Aaron, and then I will say a couple of words about how the session is going to be structured. Yeah, or maybe I will do the latter first. So Aaron will start with his presentation, social reproduction theory, disability, and the reification of labor power. After Aaron's presentation, we will have a Q&A and discussion, and we will have a short break between Aaron's presentation and the Q&A session. And should you have any access needs, please just let us know. Let myself, Luke, or Joanna know, and we'll yeah, we will make sure to address any issue you will have. Yeah, so I will introduce Aaron. Aaron is the editor at Spectre Journal. He's an associate professor of philosophy and liberal arts at Juilliard School in New York, and he's the author of Social Reproduction Theory and the Socialist Horizon: Work, Power, and Political Strategy, published by Pluto. Yes, it's really a great pleasure to have Aaron, and really excited to hear his presentation. Yeah, so Aaron, over to you. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. And then I guess 3 apologies before I start. The first, thank you for the organizers for giving me a chance to do this, and for all the labor, often unaccounted for and significant, that went into making sure that this happens. I really appreciate it. 3 apologies. I've not been able to attend these meetings in previous months. They were scheduled when I taught on Tuesdays in New York, and then I was in transit here in Montreal. So I apologize. There's something pretty rude about only showing up when it's your turn to present, and I want to acknowledge that and just let you know what's going on with me. The third is I have a 9-month-old, and these walls are not very thick. My partner is taking care of the 9-month-old, but if you hear developmentally appropriate but somewhat annoying noises, I apologize for that as well. Hopefully they won't be too disruptive. Lastly, I'm just going to read this paper. I don't have slides. I've circulated it. I sent it to Ariana, who sent it to you, I believe, July 4th, as an attachment if you want to follow along, or if you just want to consult it at some later point. I think I'll speak for about 45 minutes. Okay. Section 1, the problem of disability for social reproduction theory. For a while now, I have wondered about the tension between social reproduction theory, which I'll call SRT, which has a deep-rooted commitment to theorizing and valuing labor powers, and left theories of disability, which often theorize and criticize the determination of those very same labor powers. What might those of us who are committed to social reproduction theory, SRT, as a mode of concretizing Marxism be able to say regarding those who, through disability, are disempowered and marginalized, if not altogether excluded from developing and then actualizing their labor powers? Behind this worry, there are 3 critical thoughts that I'd like to develop here regarding the very idea of labor powers. After doing so, I'll work through some less than ideal possible solutions, and then draw on Marx himself to develop what looks to me like the best response available, given SRT's commitments to theorizing labor powers and their reproduction. To begin, the first critical worry regards the labor side of the term labor power. If by labor powers, we are really to understand only those powers that enable one to productively labor, and labor under the conditions of production imposed in particular by capital, then any theory premised on such labor powers, including SRT, would be deeply misguided. It would not only leave out of its theoretical view those who, for any number of reasons, are excluded from such activity, but this exclusion would be constitutive. I mean, this kind of exclusion wouldn't be a theoretical gap that could simply be filled in with further research or reflection. This is because, insofar as such a theory theorized and valued only actualized labor powers, it would thereby not value all other kinds of practical activity which is to say, in grasping capital, the theory itself wouldn't have the resources to point beyond capital. The theory would not be able to see all the activities not valued from the narrow standpoint of capital. Crucially, it would marginalize the activities of those who find it difficult to or simply cannot access capitalist labor markets. It cannot see all the activities that are different from those that labor for capital and would, for that reason, have a truly narrow view of labor. I think here the connection to disability is obvious. Quite a few have noted how access to labor markets and the ability to effectively compete once accessed are significant determinants of what counts as an ability and what on the other side of it is a disability. As Marta Russell in particular has taught us, though far from absolutely determining, what counts as able here and now is in large part determined by what is exploitable. I don't mean to suggest that's an exhaustive definition, but it has a certain force and power. The second critical thought then regards the other half of the term, not labor, but power. I mean to put in the forefront of our minds the question, just what is it that we are trying to think about when we use the term power in thinking about labor powers? For social reproduction theory, it is unsurprising that the way the power of labor power is determined is socially. And just as obviously, our socially determined and affirmed powers range widely over the extraordinary diversity of actually living and breathing people. So, for this reason, SRT really must avoid any kind of flattening out in its social determination of our powers. The fact that our specific capacities are tremendously diverse is where this critical thought comes in. It comes in precisely here because capital does flatten out our capacities. It does so following the first worry by valuing them only insofar as they are exploitable. Capital even homogenizes our capacities, qualitative differences, by reducing them to a common measure of what can be bought by a wage. The wage, in turn, is an expression of the money form of capital and simply covers the costs necessary to exploit and reproduce powers as commodities. Wages can themselves be only quantitatively different. It would be helpful to think that this homogenization renders abstract not only the labor, but also the powers at their basis, which are subject to this commodification. We can think and criticize the specific form of this commodified abstraction. As Guido Starosto and Gaston Caligaris have claimed, for instance, that human labor power is not of use value by its own material nature, but that it becomes form determined as such when subsumed by capital as the active condition for valorization, and all the determinants of the commodity form present in the production of labor power. We can think the powers of labor power and the powers through which it is produced and reproduced as subject to the compulsions of a peculiar version of the commodity form. And through this form, labor powers are rendered abstract in their own peculiar way. The dangers of this kind of form determination of labor power for disability can be unpacked and clarified. As Roddy Slarak has argued, disability continues to be rooted in the way the capitalist mode of production subordinates concrete labor and the concrete laborer to the abstract, interchangeable, and homogeneous labor. The set of capitalist social The set of capitalist social relations are responsible for imposing the abstract, homogenized form of labor that often shapes what counts as an ability and what counts as a disability. Capacities tend to count as labor powers only if they are, by this homogeneous reduction, potentially fit for exploitation. That is to say, powers are pressured and molded by the abstract form imposed by capital's demand for valorization. And those whose possible powers are less easily produced and continuously reproduced in a way that makes their actualization easily exploitable, well, they often end up thought through the category of disability. When this abstract form of labor power makes access to and competition in labor markets more difficult for some, it is quite literally disempowering, even disabling. The third critical thought combines these first two, the constitutively narrow view of labor and the homogenizing view of powers that render them abstract. When the narrow view of labor and the homogenizing abstract social determination of powers are combined, the labor powers, which form the basis of SRT, look like they include only those that seamlessly reproduce the violent, constraining, disempowering nature of capitalism. It would then seem as if social reproduction theory is limited to having a dangerously ahistorical and disabling view of the labor powers at the very root of its theory. Though without reference to disability, Kristen Monroe and Martha Jimenez have made this kind of argument by suggesting that SRT all too often forgets that when put into motion, labor powers reproduce capitalism, at least as much as themselves and life more broadly in anything like an innocent way. If the narrow view of labor, the abstract homogenized powers fit for exploitation at the basis of that labor, and the violent reproduction of capital setting the two on their path are all that SRT can draw on, then this blinkered vision of a capitalist present certainly deserves strong criticism, not just from the likes of Monroe and Jimenez, but from radical theorists of disability across the board. This third critical thought poses a damning problem because we can now see that SRT is at risk of reifying the disabling power of capital by naturalizing the form through which powers are socially produced and reproduced. When labor power itself is seen from the standpoint of capital as a homogenized, abstract set of capacities naturally given for exploitation, disability then appears on the other side of this view as if it is labor power's natural transhistorical other. Since the reproduction of labor powers in capitalist societies generally rests on their homogenization to the point of easy exploitation, this social arrangement appears natural instead of what it actually is, which is to say, historically produced. In other words, in our capitalist social formations, the question of what is an ability and what is a disability rests on some deeper account of the commodified form labor powers themselves have been historically constrained to take. And this account must be tied to the changing history of the social basis of production if it is to avoid being reified. Put simply, disability is reified because the notion of labor powers determining its boundaries is reified, not just because of some idealist theoretical error, but in the very exploitation essential to capital's valorization. From this perspective, disability really does force a reckoning of SRT's relation to its ground in labor powers, because the reification of the form of labor powers operates in what can be thought of as a jointly ableist and exploitable manner. If the very ableist, exploitable form of labor powers is not thrown into question by theories that try to think and resist capital, then the commodified labor power at the root of capital remains reified, not just in our practical reality. We try to think through and point beyond that reality. Labor power would remain fated to ceaselessly appear as if it is a natural category, a transhistorical given not subject to the flux and flow of different regimes of capital, and certainly not subject to anything like radical, revolutionary reformations on the basis of entirely different regimes of production. Now, this appearance is not only false, but I think worse, politically dangerous and truly disabling. From so-called primitive accumulation to so many contemporary versions of violent neoliberalism, the form that our labor powers have been given has its own history. And capital's evolving determination of that form is not only subject to its own internal combustion through its self-generated insuperable tensions. Crucially, the current ableist exploitable form can and must be thrown into question and entirely transcended by our practical Marxist project. But again, to stress the essential point, any theory of social reproduction of labor powers needs to be capacious enough to internally support the most radical versions of disability theory if it can, first of all, have within its sights capital's determination and reification of the form of those powers, and then second, point beyond that reification to truly liberatory solutions. Section 2, some limited social reproduction theoretic solutions to the problem. Now, I want to say there really are some high-quality attempts at integration that can be developed by proponents of SRT, like myself, to the problems that flow from failing to take disability seriously. Even when not, to my knowledge, made in a very explicit way, different versions of SRT have the internal resources to begin generating some valuable steps towards centering disability in a way that can move beyond these worries described above. To be sure, however, SRT does not speak in anything like a singular voice, and some constructions of the theory have a far set of resources to draw on than others. I think a strong response to the three worries would need to not only acknowledge disability, but do a fine job of deepening the criticism of disability within a broadly Marxist view that roots itself in the production, reproduction, and exploitation of labor powers. Before turning to the resources available for generating that kind of response, and taking a few steps that would begin to flesh it out, I want to first highlight a few versions of SRT that attempt solutions, or could, given their logic, attempt solutions, which seem to me to fall a bit short of the mark in one way or another. So the first, the Italian feminist tradition of social reproduction theory. And I just want to acknowledge, I'm painting with a pretty broad brush here. We can perhaps discuss that in the Q&A. One possible way to think and value labor powers differently is to focus on some specific labor or some specific set of powers that make it possible. Some have focused on socially reproductive labor within the context of the modern bourgeois, nuclear, typically cis-hetero, and indeed able-bodied family. The family which serves as a kind of model and ideal type for the private day-to-day as well as intergenerational reproduction of labor powers for capital. Now, whether waged or not, if socially reproductive forms of labor are constrained to just those that make, sustain, and remake labor power without directly producing or producing other commodities to be exchanged on markets, then the problem of how SRT ought to think and value labor powers in a less disempowering way might seem to be solved. As a way of pushing back against narrow Marxist attempts to only theorize and value productive labor, this kind of socially reproductive labor could be prized insofar as it produces and sustains life without itself being entirely commodified. This is the path taken in certain strains of post-autonomist Italian feminist theories of social reproduction. So if one puts aside for a moment that the fact that often the purpose and end of this kind of work in the home is quite often crafting some narrow, capital-dominated version of labor powers, powers that can be exchanged and exploited on capital's labor markets, then this domestic work might indeed seem like an attractive kind of labor to key into. This is because the work produces and reproduces labor power for capital without this reproductive labor being entirely reduced to or determined by a wage. One might say that though the capitalist form of labor powers is undoubtedly dominating, and indeed guiding this reproductive activity, the work in question is not itself formally subsumed by the capitalist production process. For the proponents of such a view, the often affective and care-centered approach to this work perhaps shows how the power of capital cannot be truly absolute, or at least that it can be challenged. And to be sure, this holds some promise. Though deep inroads have been made, I think it's probably impossible to entirely reduce the love expressed in a hug, in a bedtime story, or in the emotional connection of erotic attachments to the quantitative criteria appropriate to capital's abstract determination of labor powers as reified commodities. I don't think that can be done absolutely. Now, as attractive as this approach appears, and I want to be honest, it does hold significant appeal for some, I nonetheless want to suggest that this kind of solution moves too quickly. It risks valuing some socially reproductive work while challenging neither the oppressive familial and social logics that it is subject to, nor the exploitative logic its work sustains. Even if the Italian feminists' approach to demanding wages for housework is understood as a criticism of the very idea of wages, and thus implicitly of the money form, they leave untouched the root of capital in the ableist-exploitable form appropriate to its commodification of power itself. After all, their shared theoretical project is the premise that women's labor in the home produces and reproduces chains of capitalist value in the labor powers that outside the home are more directly exploited, then it's going to have a hard time pointing to truly liberatory dimensions. If we can follow the three critical thoughts I set up at the start of the paper, it becomes clear that this version of social reproduction theory can respond quite well to the problem of constitutively narrow understanding of labor. It does so by privileging not the factory but the home, and centering on what has largely been considered women's work. Unfortunately, it does less to center the second critical thought, the homogenization of our potencies. Now, to be fair, it is premised on attention. Women's gendered labor in the home is qualitatively different from other kinds of work. But resting as it does on Mario Tronti and the notion of a social factory, the view also thinks of this qualitatively different labor as value productive, and therefore as formally akin to the more directly exploited labor it produces and reproduces. Without getting too much into some old debates about Marxist theories of value and production, I think it is fair to say that when this Italian feminist tradition thinks of women's unpaid domestic work as value productive, it offers a powerful feminism, but one that cannot get at the very root of the problem in labor powers that disability points to in ways I've described above. The deeper question of disability does not, and I think more importantly, cannot appear on the theoretical horizon of this Italian feminist version of SRT, precisely because it does not think through the commodified form of the labor powers that the work they are interested in produces and reproduces. Without being attentive to the meeting point of the first and second critical thought of labor and of the powers to actualize them, we can have a certain kind of feminist version of social reproduction. And since women's work is violently constrained and constraining because of capital, even a kind of anti-capitalist version of this feminist theory of social reproduction. But what we cannot have is a thoroughgoingly revolutionary response to the constraining form that guides, determines, and dominates the powers to enjoin productive activity. Now, I've suggested disability theory is absolutely essential to this deeper, more radical project. Without centering disability, a promising response to the start of the critical concerns ultimately falls short of what theories of social reproduction really need. Second option that I think is on the table, North American, or what have been called Marxist versions of SRT, insofar as they follow a Marxist notion of value strictly conceived, or productive activity strictly conceived. Now, the second insufficient response to the critical concerns I started with is a position more common in contemporary North American articulations of SRT. I myself have at times held some of these views. Given SRT's root in theorizing labor powers, some think that we can draw on the tension between, on the one hand, need-satisfying activity, even the production of life itself, and on the other, the way capitalism often is unquestionably worthy goals. The way capital is guided by its valorizing imperative over and above life-making and need-satisfying activities means, as we have seen, that capital rests on a disabling production and reproduction of labor powers. While clearly a valuable response to the first critical thought, the narrow view of labor, this response can be pushed even further. Struggles in pursuit of quote-unquote concrete life, as such, can, according to Rebecca Carson, even if not explicitly, at least, quote, implicitly undermine the domination of value forms, end quote. The thought here is that the specificity of concrete lives and powers puts the lie to the homogenizing force of the ableist-exploitable form of labor powers. Now, the other side of the thought centering on the constraint of capital offers another path to have this kind of thought. Beyond capital's constraints, SRT's commitment to valuing the diversity and open-ended freedom of labor powers as values in their own right can perhaps also push back against the second critical thought. This is because the way capital homogenizes labor powers constrains the freedom and diversity appropriate to our potentials. A commitment to the freedom of developing diverse powers as values in their own right certainly touches on the narrow view of labor, but it even more obviously challenges the constraining form determination imposed by capital in its shaping of those powers. A bit more explicitly than the implicit challenge by concrete life, this version of SRT's commitment to the freedom, diversity of our potentials challenges capital's abstract, reified, and disabling constraints on our capacities to primarily or exclusively developing into exploitable labor power. Now, this two-pronged response from North American versions of SRT does a bit better than the Italian feminist tradition, because it better recognizes the problem posed by homogenization. For this reason, it is quite close to, and even at times tries to criticize the form-determining power of capital to shape our labor powers in an abstract, disabling way. Yet despite this general step in what seems like a good direction, even when the two paths are taken together, this version of SRT seems to me to still be missing the essential problematic that can be clarified when disability is used to think the reified, ableist exploitable form articulated through and imposed on our labor powers. This is because the social reproduction of need-satisfying and even life-making labor powers are not themselves radically distinct from the social reproduction of the dangerously abstract form that dominates and gives them shape. Thinking that the two are distinct, that the reified form lies on one side and on the other lie the powers that could be simply enjoined or developed better or more freely without capital, is itself evidence of reified, even classically fetishistic thinking. The form is taken as a given, independent of the social relations through which it is articulated, and upon which, in turn, its power to arrange production of value is exercised. Looked at in this light, even the more promising version of SRT too often still has a glaring blind spot.
Sorry,
but
Aaron,
how could this be?
Aaron,
Yeah. So thinking that the two, that the form and the concrete specificities are distinct that reified form lies on one side, and the other lie the powers that could simply be enjoined or developed better or more freely without capital, is itself evidence of reified, even classically fetishistic thinking. The form is taken as a given, independent of the social relations through which it is articulated, and upon which, in turn, its power to arrange the production of value is exercised. Looked at in this light, even the more promising version of SRT too often still has a glaring blind spot. But how could this be the case? The powers to satisfy needs, to make life, and to direct the development of further capabilities are too often valued as if they are pure, independent of the ableist-exploitable form that this version of SRT can see as dangerously dominating, even disabling. The problem, of course, is that this assumption of independence is far from justified. The power to make life, to satisfy needs, and to direct future potentials are themselves part of and wrapped up into the social reproduction of the very form of labor powers that needs to be theoretically criticized and practically transcended. Perhaps then, it is not too much to suggest that the abstractly ableist-exploitable form that labor powers are constrained to take under conditions of capital has a subterraneous presence, even in the way some versions of SRT value freedom, further development, and certain kinds of diversity. At any rate, thinking of the constraining form on one side and the valued potentials on the other is not only wrong, but doing so can have serious political theoretic consequences. Misrecognizing the nature of existing potentials can overestimate their practical value as they're currently formed, and thereby underestimate the kind of amount of revolutionary work ahead. I think the most practical way to express this worry is that the disabled of the proletariat might be excluded from revolutionary agency, while the disabling social form itself is left in place. The reality of the damaging social abstraction must be recognized as both shaped by and contributing to violent social relations. In centering this fact, what disability forces SRT to see is the need to entirely reorganize the vast field of potentials and capacities. It should be clear, my switch now from labor powers to potentials and capacities is important, as the very notion of labor powers, so appropriate to the study of capitalist social formations, probably needs to be fleshed out with different content if it is to point towards liberation. So, what resources might SRT draw on to offer a sufficient response to these critical worries? Well, Section 3, SRT Beyond Fetishism, or How to Take Disability Seriously. So far, I hope to have shown that through its focus on labor powers, SRT is a promising approach to concretizing Marxism. It recognizes different kinds of labor, different kinds of concrete powers, and aims for their freedom beyond how they are produced and reproduced for capital. Despite that being the case, in too many of its theoretical expressions, SRT's silence about the problems posed by disability render the very ground of its theorizing in labor powers dangerously unstable. The theory thereby falls short of what I think it can be. Even when theorists of SRT make attempts to focus on concrete labor and, with an expansive notion of labor powers, push back against the dominating social relations that shape and constrain ability itself, too many versions of SRT avoid thinking about the specific social form of labor powers engendered by, and in turn dominating, these labor powers. The form becomes significant. What I have described as the ableist-exploitable social form of labor powers can be thought, in a Hegelian vein, as having three moments. The first moment is comprised of all the socially affirmed labor powers that through effective competition in labor markets, some get to actualize. The second is comprised of all the non-socially affirmed and marginalized powers with which others are endowed. These remain largely unactualized. Both the activity and the inactivity of powers are necessary to think the articulation of the form. The third moment is then the violent domination of this articulated form on the ongoing production and reproduction of this divided field of powers. Since the three moments comprise a moving whole, this whole is truly intelligible only when, as I've suggested, disability is understood in relation to ability, and when this relation itself is socially reproduced in a way that challenges the reified appearance of the form by insisting on its historical motion. This, I think, is what it would mean to take disability seriously. How then might SRT shore up its ground by taking disability seriously in this threefold way? Here I think we can turn to Marx himself, in particular the definition of labor power and capital, Volume 1, and then his more historical and political discussion of labor powers in his scathing critique of the Gotha Program. In Capital, Marx is very careful to differentiate labor, or the activity of setting capacities into motion, from the capacities themselves, which must lie at the basis of any such activity. Both are imbricated in peculiar social relations, including legal and property relations, through which capacities are bought, sold, produced, and reproduced as commodities. When Marx describes individuals as doubly free, that is, free from all means of production and free to sell their powers to work, he means, through such irony, to highlight the violent social relations that give freedom this peculiar shape. It is a freedom imposed through capitalist legal and property relations, and which constrains labor powers to their commodified form. Marx articulated a much broader view of freedom over and against this view of doubly free labor powers. He saw labor powers as capacities, the exercise of which produce a use value of any description. It's a direct quote. The capacities themselves can be physical or mental, but are always socially imbricated and individually embodied. Only under conditions of capital are these broad capacities narrowed by the specific need to take the form of an exploitable commodity and to constantly reproduce themselves in this commodified form. Against any reifying view, Marx is emphatic, and here I quote, "One thing, however, is clear. Nature does not produce, on the one hand, owners of money or commodities, and on the other hand, men possessing nothing but their own labor power. This relation has no basis in natural history, nor does it have a social basis common to all periods of human history. It is clearly the result of a past historical development, the product of many economic revolutions, of the extinction of a whole series of older formations of social production." End quote. The key insight to take from Marx's de-reifying approach to labor powers is that the form of their commodification that they're constrained to take in capitalism is the culmination of a long, long history of social production. Even if they have been and could be otherwise, when dominated by social relations through which wealth appears as commodities, labor powers are constrained in their production and reproduction to this ableist-exploitable form. Under such conditions, Marx, quoting Sismondi, reminds us that, quote, "the capacity of labor is nothing unless it is sold," end quote, which is a capital-specific determination of the broader truth Marx held, quote, "labor power becomes a reality only by being expressed. It is activated only through labor," end quote. While actualized capacities contribute to and are pressured to fit into the mold of what is easily exploitable, unactivated capacities are constrained to a vast field of irreality at risk of extinction because it is harder or entirely impossible for them to be sold. In following Marx's analysis and thinking the social reproduction of labor powers under capital, SRT can think the first and the second moment as simultaneous and co-constituting. The actualization of labor powers by some and the non-actualization by others produces and reproduces the specifically ableist, exploitable form of their commodification. This form guides the production and reproduction of a narrow version of labor powers, while at the very same time, it produces and reproduces the inability to develop and actualize powers in others. In other words, by following Marx here, we can see that thinking the social reproduction of labor powers requires thinking how the force of their form is engendered through actualizations as well as their marginalizations and inactivity. Though it might not seem obvious given its reification, it is important to stress that even the extinction of marginalized powers plays its part in the evolving history of the ableist exploitable form. It sets the extreme limit of that which, through disability, cannot be reproduced in the existing social organization. If above the hidden abode of production there hangs the sign, "no admittance except on business," in the developing reified realm of reproduction, the sign reads, "no exit except without business." But even the extinction of this exit has the effect of contributing to a violent social order through which the form of labor powers appropriate capital evolves in its limited and narrowly bordered way. When relying on Marx in thinking the unactualized powers are nothing in this reified realm, but nonetheless contribute for precisely that reason to the very basis of capital's reification, SRT has the resources to take disability very seriously. By placing the otherwise invisible nature of disability at the very center of the form determination of labor powers as homogenized commodities, SRT can move beyond fetishizing the commodity form of these powers and recognize the extraordinary deep social violence of capital. It can thereby have a critical relation to the potentials it wants to value beyond their existing forms determination by capital. Adopting this approach to the form of labor powers is necessary for any attempt to appropriately think through and point towards a more liberated field of potentials. And this, in turn, is crucial to situating the freedom of labor powers beyond the ironic double freedom Marx quite rightly used to think them under conditions of capital. With this more theoretical grounding under our feet, we can now, and this is, I think, the last section of the paper, we can now turn to Marx's critique of the Gotha Program. Doing so will help develop a liberatory political response to socially reproduced violence of the ableist exploitable form through which capital determines labor powers here and now. At the very start of his critique, Marx insisted that a socialist program cannot pass over in silence the circumstances that alone give meaning to how labor power is a source of wealth. He then immediately turned to developing a historical view of these circumstances and criticizing views that conceive of labor as resting on transhistorical and supernatural powers. What counts as useful labor here and now hangs on the existing social organization of production. When Marx criticizes Lassalle for holding that useful labor is possible only in society and through society, he is criticizing an ahistorical view of social reproduction that has at all times been made use of by the champions of the prevailing state of society at a given time. At the very least, such hollow phrases can be twisted and turned as desired. In then suggesting that in the transition from capitalism to communism, it wouldn't be possible to immediately transcend abstract determinations of labor power, Marx is simply following through on his commitments to thinking labor powers in relation to their changing social basis. After all, the form our powers can take must be understood in light of their social ground, that is, in the circumstances of their production. Communist social grounds aim for the all-round development of the individual and all the springs of cooperative wealth, but these dual goals cannot be achieved until the capitalist ground is cleared and richer soil is prepared. Now, to get there, Marx insisted on overcoming, quote, the subordination of the individual to the division of labor, end quote. It is not that, in communism, individuals would be prohibited from developing or concentrating their powers in specific ways. Rather, individuals doing so would not be subordinated, that is dominated by a social organization of production that compels such specialization by increasingly dividing labor in attempts to maximize rates of exploitation. Communist individuals would focus their capacities to the extent desired as a free expression of their need for development. Lassalle's demand that the undiminished proceeds of labor be returned to the laborers was the main object of Marx's criticism in the Critique of the Gotha Program, precisely because it did nothing to move in this freer direction. This is because it would have done nothing to challenge the reified form that guides labor powers disabling social reproduction. Accepting the existing form of labor and directly returning its proceeds would provide none of the resources necessary to practically challenge and begin generating the much needed new social determinations of our powers. This is why Marx deducted, quote, that which is intended for the common satisfaction of needs, such as schools, health services, etc., end quote, from Lassalle's undiminished proceeds, and further, why Marx thought that, quote, this part grows considerably in comparison with present-day society, and it grows in proportion as the new society develops, end quote. The more societies approaching communism leave their capitalist prehistory behind them, the more social wealth is devoted to the production and reproduction of a communist society through privileging the production of individuals' capacities. In other words, against Lassalle, Marx insisted that communist politics requires the social and historical generation of a new determination of our powers through an entirely different social basis. The social wealth devoted to education and healthcare certainly satisfy individuals' mental and physical capacities. Everyone certainly needs intellectual development and physical health. In developing the individual, however, social wealth is not merely enjoined individually, it is also, as Marx suggested, devoted to the common satisfaction of needs. This is because when social wealth develops mental and physical abilities, it begins to transform individuals' needs into being at the same time social needs. Though socialized education and healthcare alone cannot get us communism, they're necessary. A more socialized form of individuals' mental and physical capacities is made possible in proportion as the new society develops. And against Lassalle, Marx is suggesting that fighting for these arrangements are important parts of any socialist program. As Peter Hudis reminds us in the introduction to A New Translation, for Marx, the mental constraint of fetishism begins to dissolve only when we encounter other forms of production. It is not just that Marx reserves a portion of social wealth for those unable to work and for poor relief. The logic of Marx's account pushes him to a social historical determination of labor powers that would transcend any need for poor relief in the first place. This revolutionary commitment can be achieved only by the continuous transformation of the social basis that gives all labor powers meaning and shape. In this way, Marx is committed to transcending individual subordination to the ableist-exploitable form and to achieving a social order in which the production and continuous reproduction of diverse labor powers are simultaneously individually and socially valued in their own. If we previously had the inscription "No admittance except on business" in the midst of a larger enveloping environment bearing the title "No exit without business," the communist determination of labor powers finally moves beyond this marginalization essential to this homogenized commodification. Labor powers would be their own ends in a jointly individual and social manner, and this is why the communist sign can read from each according to his ability, to each according to his need. Even though the term disability appears nowhere in Marx's critique of the Gotha program, the text's political commitments, I'm skipping lines because I feel like I'm running late. So just the next paragraph. Even though the term disability appears nowhere in Marx's critique of the Gotha program, the text's political commitments nonetheless rest on a notion of abilities implicit in Marxist thinking about labor powers. This in turn provides a fine communist foil and radical political horizon above and beyond the homogenized, reified, and too often fetishized ableist-exploitable form that flows from and subordinates labor powers today. Crucially, Marx's political commitments in his critique respond to Lassalle by thinking beyond the violent reproduction of the commodified form of labor power, by stressing common satisfaction of needs, a newly social form of wealth, and in particular to the development of powers in and towards a new social organization of production. Marx provides a political response aiming to shape the future development of our capacities. So to conclude, taken together, Capital's critical analysis of labor powers and the critique of the Gotha program's orientation of our powers towards communism provides SRT with the resources to think through and point beyond the ableist exploitable form they are currently constrained to take. Doing so reveals the essentially historical nature of their form, which is key to dereifying and avoiding any fetishized understanding of them. When SRT thinks the social and historical determination of this form through both the actualization of powers and their sidelining through disability, it can take disability seriously. And via disability, this stronger version of SRT can think the production and reproduction of labor powers as acquiring a concreteness worthy of being truly valued only under a radically different social basis of production. When the concreteness of labor flowing from powers dominated by capital is recognized as simultaneously abstract and disabling, SRT can move away from either drawing on the labor of some or any set of labor powers on this side of capital as if they were legitimate normative resources. By instead drawing on Marx and thinking through the form of labor powers, SRT can take disability seriously and thereby avoid the critical worries developed at the start of this paper. In doing so, SRT can sharpen its criticism of capital and better support its communist aspirations. And I think I'll stop there.
Yeah, well done. Thank you so much. This was such a roller coaster of ideas. It was really amazing. Yeah, so well, maybe we can take like 5 minutes for people to gather their thoughts and develop questions, and then we can reconvene here like in 5 minutes or so for the Q&A.
Okay. Okay, so should I?
What's the format for getting on the list to speak or raise a question?
Yes, so you can either raise your hand or write your name in the chat box, and then we will keep track of the order of people wanting to ask questions. So yeah, feel free. Yes. Okay, so next will be Keith. I don't know, Aaron, if you want to reply to Suzanne's question or yes.
I can go really quickly in response to Susan, and then Keith. I see Keith and Luke. Okay. Yeah, I did my PhD at the New School in philosophy, not in economics, but I was a work study assistant. My first job in grad school was working for the economics department. At any rate, that's besides the point. Yeah, I tend to think that Marx has a coherent notion of what socially necessary labor time is, and that it is not transhistorical, but socially determined based on changing sets of social relations and production relations at their basis. And so I would need to hear a little bit more about where you think the incoherence comes from, which is probably a discussion for a different forum. But the other question that you had seems really sharp. Do I have a kind of social model of disability? And I think you made reference to versions of impairment that become disadvantages only when set in motion through a labor market, or only when incapable of effectively competing or less efficient in competing on labor markets. And I think that at least Vogel, from the standpoint of social reproduction theory, in her great book Marxism and the Oppression of Women, describes some women's, I think she has a biologically essentialist view of womanhood, but we could still say that some women gestate, give birth, and are less effectively competitive during those periods on capitalist labor markets. And so there is a root in biology that only becomes a disability when set into when it needs to compete through capitalist social relations. And I think that's a nice way of having of integrating women's oppression and an analysis of capital. And I think that we can do that more broadly with what even gets thought of under the rubric of scare quotes disability. And that's the kind of, I'm taking a capital specific approach to any social determination, because without an understanding of capital, your grounding of what counts as a social determination is just going to be confused. But those are perhaps too quick. Maybe we can come back. But I think Keith, should I field my own questions, or does the moderator want to take stack and then call on people?
No, as you prefer. We can, you can either call or I can. I'm keeping track, but you can address the person as soon as you've finished. If you remember, you're free to ask. So Keith, please go ahead. But Aaron, feel free as soon as you finish to call the person that, if you remember.
Hi, Aaron. We haven't yet formally met, but I did work with you on a Spectre article.
Good to see you.
A couple months ago, yeah. So let's see. I will try to formulate this succinctly, although I do think that, it's a credit to your, effort that it raises, I think, a slew of questions and touches upon a, cascading number of things, at least in my mind, that, could make for a lot of different discursions that this could take. But I guess a couple things I'll just ask is, one, in terms of social reproduction theory, and it sounds like what you're trying to do is a sort of revision, right? A sort of, you want to keep the primary model of social reproduction theory, but add or either center or append disability. And I wonder what you think of, so just the reading that I've done, this is something also I've thought is like, how do you talk about labor that is ancillary to the production process, or not at all involved. The closest I've seen was in Tithi Bhattacharya's book, Social Reproduction Theory. There's one piece by someone, Oran, I'm not sure, it's S.S. Oran. It takes up the question of pensions, both old age and disability pensions, and frames it, and it's the closest I've seen to getting towards disability, but frames it in terms of a like broad social wage that out of the social product total, the capitalists set aside a portion of that for, which is something Marx, you talk about, Marx points to in the critique of the Gotha program, but puts aside a portion of it for pensions, sick, poor relief, etc., and that is part of the broadly defined social reproduction of the working class, is taking care of the working class in all of its various points in time and development and so on. So I wonder what you think about that, how that, fits into that. Because I think that is the closest I've seen, but it doesn't quite, there's a way in which, obviously we can talk about the important role that employed labor, right? That labor employed in the production of exchange values, surplus values plays. But I think that there's a more, and this is something that, and this is why I'm interested in what Susan is raising, and I'm interested in hearing Susan's, various thoughts on these things, is that it's something I've been thinking a lot about, is how do you have a comprehensive, theory of disability from the standpoint of, well, broadly, I would say, Marxist economics, but a sort of historical economic interpretation of capitalism, and disability as a integral element of the capitalist production process, right? That it's not necessarily central in the way that labor itself may be in the production of surplus values, but it's nonetheless an essential element, like one could talk about analogously the reserve army, or something like that. Although I do think that disability, the way that I've been thinking about it more is as a commodity form. And if you think about labor power as a commodity, the basic unit of capital, a disability then is synonymous with a quote unquote defective commodity, or a diminished value of this essential commodity form. Yeah, there's other things. I do want to just finally ask why, or what is your intention in putting disability in quotes throughout? That's, I could guess at why you're doing that. Maybe would like to hear if there is a theoretical or ideological or semantic reason why you're doing that.
It's so wonderful to have such a clear-sighted and attentive listener. Thank you, Keith. You're exactly right. I am trying to keep what I consider to be primary about social reproduction theory and the way that it thinks through the capitalist social relations premised on labor powers, production and reproduction. But I am trying to add, center, or append disability in a way that I at first thought I could rather easily, and the more seriously, the more time I've spent thinking about it in the last 3 or 4 years, the more I've begun to realize that, or come to the conclusion that I think disability really does pose a major challenge to a standard Marxist determination of labor powers. And I was like, but I'm still a Marxist. I'm still committed to thinking the production of capitalist social relations on the basis of exploited labor powers. So how can a social reproduction theorist, one committed to thinking through capital through the basis of labor powers, deal with this challenge? And like you, I turned to the commodity form because labor powers are themselves commodified. And I thought, well, what relation does disability have to the commodified form? And I like your thought, Keith, that they're synonymous with a defective commodity or of diminished value, obviously in scare quotes, when saying that, or in quotes that remind the reader that this is true only under conditions of capitalist social relations. But what I tried to do here with this paper is think through the ways that even those quote unquote defective commodities, or it lies on the other side of the commodity form, is itself continuously produced and reproduced in a way that establishes the dividing line between what counts as able-bodied and as less capacious or disabled from the standpoint of capital. And so I tried to integrate that negative moment into an account of the evolving history of the form of the labor powers as commodified, as commodities under conditions of capital. And so I think I could, if you give me permission, use the idea defective commodity or diminished value and try to, because I think that's insightful. But I would also like to show the role that those play in reproducing the violent social form itself. And you're right also about the Oran piece. That is one of the rare moments of getting kind of close. We don't do, as a school, as a social reproduction theory generally has not done a good job of thinking about disability. I briefly tried to do so in a comparative literature and culture paper on the labor form and value, which is just not good. It's just not a good paper, and it's not theoretically compelling. I tried to solve a big problem too quickly. But yeah, there's just not a whole lot of work out there. And there should be. There needs to be, because I think I'm right about the 3 critical challenges I posed at the start of the paper. Lastly, your concern, what's my intention in putting disability in quotes throughout? that there was to just to do my utmost, even at the level of punctuation, to de-reify, to denaturalize it. I think that within this group of people who are committed Marxists, this is a Marxist discussion group after all, referring to Martha Russell would do enough, but for people outside of this group, the text really does need to be continuous in reminding those who are less familiar with these terms that it's in scare quotes, that it's under social historical conditions appropriate to today and not transhistorical. So that was my intention, but I'm not absolutely committed to that. If you've got a good reason why you think I shouldn't be, I'm totally open to hearing it. Or maybe I can add a footnote explaining the different considerations and why it's in quotes or not. But yeah, that's not a strong commitment on my end.
Amazing answer, thanks. Yeah, Luke, if you want to go ahead.
Thanks. So I have one question which is SRT related and one question which is more specifically on the definition of disablement you use. And I'm taking the definition that you give in your book as being contiguous with this paper. And please forgive me if I've misinterpreted that. But to start with the SRT related question, I really enjoyed your move from labor power to capacities when talking about normative horizons and also an understanding of the multifold ways in which capitalism as a system of exploitation and ultimately the reproduction of labor power becomes stymied, forced into certain matrices, etc. And I've often kind of caught myself going, well, why hasn't social reproduction theory done this before? I think there's a strong case in Marx for doing so. I do think there is a political drawback, though, and it's one that maybe requires a theoretical defense against it, which is where there have been theories of social reproduction that haven't been entirely grounded in labor power, i.e. they've been grounded, they've attempted to explain how labor power is reproduced, but they've said that not everything which reproduces it is itself labor power. It requires the reproduction of moral economies, for example, the reproduction of legal systems, reproduction of ideological systems, so on and so forth. And I'm thinking particularly about Ian Goff's work here. The conclusion that's been reached there is that the social reproduction account given, while meritorious on its own grounds and aiding an analysis of capital, isn't particularly helpful in the things that a social reproduction theory would like to be able to do. So, for example, Goff says fairly explicitly at the end of his that this doesn't really help with explaining the oppression of women, right? Insofar as when you look at all of the different forms of embodied activity necessary to reproduce capital, which is not itself directly producing value, then actually that will include sectors of activity which are highly gendered male as well as those which are highly gendered female. So the army, the judiciary, the police force. Goff was writing in the 70s, right? So the police force is much more male then, etc. But you end up with this thing that, yes, it shows an extreme of gendering, but it's unable to say anything particularly specific about female gendering as opposed to male gendering. So that would be my first question, really, is do you think that it's possible to reconstruct an SRT which doesn't end up in that position of no longer being able to give as coherent or as detailed a response it wants to, as it may want to what was initially a core consideration? The second is specifically around disablement and its definition in the capacities which are not valued by capital as opposed to the ones which are. Now, I wonder, for purposes of categorization, whether you feel that those capacities can be defined from each other, differentiated from each other on detail and degree, or do they need to be qualitatively differentiated at a larger scale? It strikes me that there are empirical problems with both, insofar as there are contextual and luck reasons why a certain capacity may be valued in one place in time and not be valued in another place in time, which makes, I don't think it's necessarily a huge problem, but it can make some forms of differentiation really, really gray areas. But if we're dealing with a much more qualitative differentiation of capacities, then I think that there are political problems with that as well, insofar as if we're saying, okay, well, disabled people don't have the qualities which capital wishes to exploit, but they have some other ones which could be set free as capacities in the form of social transformation, that does, as I think you indicated in the paper, there's a risk of that veering into, well, disabled people, all will be great after the revolution, but for now, you don't have any revolutionary agency. And we're kind of relegated to mutual aid work and cheerleading, both of which suck. So I wondered if you could give some clarity on the point of differentiation of capacities, how much difference does there need to be for us to say that this is a genuinely different capacity, as opposed to the same capacity, the same life getting life, but interspersed in matrices in slightly different ways or interpreted in slightly different ways.
Okay, yeah, both of those are great. So I do think that there's two different ways to think about labor powers here. One is from the standpoint of their naturalization under conditions of capital, and the other is in a contentless ahistorical way that demands being fleshed out through socially and historically determined content. Now, I think in Marx, there actually is in Capital a definition of labor powers as that which through exercise produces a use value of any description. And he's got a kind of transhistorical notion of labor powers as really doing anything that creates something useful, something that you could use even independent of systems of exchange. And so it might be the case, and this is the approach I took in the book, that we have a supremely broad understanding of labor powers. And in fact, we need to have a really broad notion of labor powers, even under conditions of capital. Otherwise, we wouldn't be able to think they're being constrained as a violence, right? If all powers could be the ways that they're actualized, then okay. But it is their constraint, which means that powers are constitutive of a much broader horizon, an evolving set of capacities. And so I think that's one way to do it. Another way to do it is to try to mark the distinction, as I did in this paper here, between labor powers as a way to understand capital and a broader set of capacities or potencies that can describe a more liberatory social horizon. But I think that might just be a semantic difference as long as I give proper definitional arrangement and explanation, because I think, grounded in Marx's text, you could probably go either way. But I agree with you, there is a political drawback to not grounding things in labor powers. And indeed, the Italian feminist tradition did try to do so in an attempt to suggest that labor powers exercise was value productive. I try to get around that problem by saying, it might not be productive, but that just means it's not productive of value, which we object to. And so you can have all kinds of ancillary forms of labor that are socially productive of a set of capitalist social relations that don't themselves produce value. And you can say, like, they're constrained by the commodity form, even if they're not value productive. And that's pretty easy insofar as wages are paid through money, which is the commodity, the money form. So the internal links to get there are certainly possible. But I recognize that the potential political drawback is there. I just don't think it's as strong as it needs to be if we say, saying that it's not value productive, saying that it's not an exercise of labor power that produces value is a reason to politically denigrate it or find it less important. I think we can say it's super important, maybe even most important. And, as long as the cessation of it stops flows of capital, then it doesn't need to be at the point of production in order to pose major problems through strikes. They can be at what Cade Doyle Griffiths has called the point of social reproduction. You can have meaningful strikes that really shut shit down. So I think that there's a different way of thinking politically through that problem, although I think I recognize what you're getting at. Now, the second part of the question, does SRT have the resources to give, if you'll allow me the term, a kind of fine-grained phenomenology of the experiences of oppression, or at least a social account that can be more grounded in a specific way of thinking through oppressions rather than just saying it's capitalism or rooting everything. Does that sound like a fair recap of the second part of the question?
It's more to do with how the categorization process happens. It doesn't have to be about lived experience or anything like that. But it seems that the same capacities in detail can be incorporated in one sphere of totality, but not in others. So there are multiple further mediations, and it becomes much more difficult to go, well, these are the capacities that make disabled. So that would be the question. And I think that's a preferable option, right? Like, I think if we just go on wider qualities, then we end up kind of like, I don't know, we become a different race or something. I'm not super keen on that. But yeah.
Yeah, I am totally open to thinking through the advantages and disadvantages, but my initial of quantity or quality or like gradations or huge qualitative differences, but my initial feeling is much like yours, I believe, in that I think it's useful to think through a kind of what's the term, a spectrum of differently capacious embodied lives that are selected for and pushed or molded or shaped in their production and reproduction by enveloping social relations. And that it makes sense to inquire in a given specific social form where the dividing line is and where the dividing line is moving, because I want to insist that it is in constant motion. And our ability to do that is going to rest more on applied social reproduction theory. Like a philosophy person can give you like the outline or the structure or can build the theoretical apparatus, but it's going to take an actual sociologist or anthropologist or ethnographer of some kind or historian or economist or all of those skills combined to actually do the necessary work that the theoretical apparatus points towards. And so I think it can. I think social reproduction theory is capacious enough to be keyed into, and in fact, there's lots of anthropology that relies on a social reproduction frame, although not to my knowledge, resting on a notion of the commodified form of labor powers in a way that I'm trying to suggest would be helpful for thinking through disability. So that's my theoretical innovation. But that plus doing the work necessary to flesh it out in social determinations of actual existing people in lived settings will amount to something. So it's a propadudict.
Yeah, amazing answer. Yes, I think it's Susan. If you want to ask your question, thanks.
Actually, it's a couple of that sort of interrelate. All right. So, as we know, just because you produce a commodity doesn't mean you actually produce surplus value or the value or the surplus as well. So, in this case, for example, a lot of traditional women's labor, when it is brought into the market, still does not produce surplus value in terms of it's exploited, certainly, but in itself does not produce surplus value. So it does. I mean, if you're sitting there, education, does it produce surplus value? There we go. Here's a good example. All right. So my point on that is, and also something that's, it might be a little concrete, but disabled people actually do work. Okay. In a lot of the assumptions that we're sitting here saying, it implies that for some reason they don't. The thing is reasonable adjustments, and this is just basic reform ideology, all right, allow and enable disabled people to participate and be included in all forms of what we consider within capitalist society and without. So one of the things that I wanted to raise is, just as women's labor power at home doesn't produce a surplus, a lot of women's labor within the market also doesn't produce the surplus or a surplus value. Is through transfers of revenue for think of childcare, nursery schools, things along those lines, which are essential women's labor. The reason I raise maybe there is a problem with Marx's notion of necessary social labor time is that large portions of socially necessary labor time are not done in the workplace. They're done outside of the workplace. They are. I mean, women's labor, it's not only biological or oppression. It's ridiculous. It's having a baby is not oppressive. It's actually the social relations in addition to it that are the oppression. So you don't have to have children to be an oppressed woman. You're sitting there in a completely different situation where you're doing additional labor at home without being paid for it. So it's unpaid labor. On the other hand, you at the same time are contributing to the capitalist economic system because they don't have to pay for it. And that's something that we need to try to incorporate into our discussion. So this is along the lines where I was saying there might be problems with the way that socially necessary labor time has been put forward, because again, it's not a fallback to an earlier system. It's something that has been maintained and continues to be maintained. within the capitalist economic system. And why is this the case? Because they don't really want to pay for it. So why is childcare, which is not, how do they make profits in child? They squeeze wages because there's no surplus production or surplus value production. So everything in that sense is a transfer of revenue. So maybe I'm closer to Katie Doyle Griffith's position on this. We can do revolutionary action around it. But to me, revolutionary action is not being paid for staying at home and taking care of our houses and our families. The points that Lise Vogel made, and I thought there was some brilliant points there, and this is why I keep on going back to this, is what is it that is done at home that enables the capitalist economic system to function? And social reproduction is not just producing the next physical generation, it's training and socializing the next generation. So this is why I'm saying there might be a problem with that's why I say it might be a part of where Marx is actually coming from and the period of time. So we have the state, we even have them forcing on privatization of things that should never be privatized, because these are part of social relations. How then do we deal with it? I just wanted to raise in the context of this, the importance. I'm worried about different, I think that's a really good innovation. The thing that I'm worried about by using the term different capacities is that it implies that this is biological rather than something fulfilling the needs of within the system. So people have different capacities, we have different skills, we have different forms of knowledge, but a lot of these things come through the system itself. However, the question that I'm answering, if we say different capacities, is that different capacities in what sense? In the sense that we can do different things within the capitalist labor process, but that would be the case for everybody. Not all of us can be brain surgeons. So it's a question more of looking at concrete labor as well as the abstract. I understand the essence of the abstract labor and what is being attempted through de-skilling and things along those lines. But I'm concerned. I think your point is a really interesting one. I love the way that you did it. I'm just a little concerned about that. I really think it's a very good contribution and it's a good way of looking at it. It's just me being a little worried. That's it.
Yeah, sorry. Just I'm aware of the time. I was wondering, are we going to generate a new link or we
have
needing to
5 minutes left.
Okay.
So I think as long as we're all kind of succinct in that time, we should be good.
Okay, yeah, Keith, if you want to very quickly ask a question so that Aaron can answer both your question and Susan's. If you can be very as brief as possible so Aaron can answer. Thanks.
Keith, mate, you
forgot to unmute. Yes. First, so this I just wanted to share. This is an article based on a talk I gave at Socialism Conference a year ago that takes up some of these questions, poses some questions and around, because I do think, Aaron, I've come to agree that the central way to frame disability in a critical economic, socioeconomic theory is around the question of the commodification of labor power. I really think that's crucial, and I'm curious what you and others would think of that piece at a later date. But I guess I'll just say, well, I don't want to take up too much time. So I'll just say, Susan, you raise a lot that I think is very valid and valuable. There's a lot I would like to, respond to what you have said. So maybe there's a venue to do that further elsewhere, because I think that is very, very fruitful and important direction.
So I think,
yes,
so I think, Susan, you pointed to some things that I need to be a little bit sharper on. I think I had a tendency in this paper to say, okay, so, disability just marks those who have a harder time competing on labor markets and, are less effective in selling their labor powers. But that's not necessarily true. Disabled people do work productively, that is in producing value for capital, but also in other fields. And that's really important to stress. So I need to rely on Mark to Russell, but also do a better job of emphasizing that this cannot be the whole story we tell about capital and the relation to disability. I have a very important person in my life who is really good at pattern recognition and is probably somewhere on the autism spectrum, but that has helped her tremendously in certain kinds of work that she's done for quite a while, the pattern recognition part, whereas other parts, so there's, I need to be really clear about the dividing line not being as sharp as I've posed it perhaps in this paper. I just think I disagree about your argument about large portions of socially necessary labor time being done outside the workplace, complicating Marx's notion of socially necessary labor time, because I think that socially necessary labor time for Marx describes the labor time necessary for the production of a commodity for sale, and that even if there's a tremendous amount of socially necessary labor that takes lots of time, so long as that labor is not enjoined in the production of commodities on markets, then it doesn't really pose a theoretical problem for his understanding what he's trying to do in setting up the analysis of commodity in capital there. So yeah, but you're right, there is a ton of unpaid labor in the home that is a source of oppression. And that we can't just rely on that and say like, oh, that's the good stuff. We need to center that. And like, no, because that contributes in large part to the reproduction of capitalism. And we need to look at concrete labor, but not under existing conditions. We need to concretize labor by seeing ways beyond even concrete labor's other side, that is its abstractness, its compulsion to fit into, or at least in some way comply with the mold of what I've called the abstract exploitable labor power form. I know there's less than a minute left, so I think I should probably end it there. The real take home for the paper is that even concrete labor under conditions of capital cannot be relied on as a vehicle for social reproduction theory and its liberatory horizons.